So first of all, I wanted to say thank you to Ellen, head of Social Action Committee at Temple Sinai, for helping to bring me here this evening. The one regret is that I cannot be with you folks at your place in Cinnaminson because of the ongoing pandemic. Of course, we're obviously being safe, and that is a good thing. Hopefully, maybe sometime in the future, I can meet some of you, if not more of you, in person. Given that, most of my career, I've been a teaching emphasis faculty. I also do research in the social sciences. I have to say that these sorts of events, these sort of public talks, are some of the greatest things, some of the most joys that I can have in my career. I've been fortunate enough to be able to give talks on various topics involving politics and culture. Some of the things we're going to talk about this evening, community and civic-oriented organizations, things like Rotary Internationals, those sorts of things. And I have to say that it is a deep honor to be invited by such an obviously family, community, engaged organization such as yours, and especially such a morally and ethically attuned organization such as Temple Sinai. So it's a deep honor to be invited to this, and I thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to meet all of you, at least virtually. And it's also, one of the things that's hopefully fun about these talks. We're not going to talk necessarily completely about the most fun topics. Obviously, we're going to delve into trends in anti-Semitism and some other serious topics during our discussion. But, I hope that we can have a discussion on this at some point. I think Ellen was saying that maybe at least 10 or more minutes at the end. I was prepared to talk maybe at least 30 or 40 minutes, something like that. We'll see how far I go with that. But please, whenever there are questions, let's talk about them, because that, making this a discussion and making it dynamic is what makes this hopefully interactive and most valuable for you folks as well. So just a little bit about me. I'm Brandon Chapman. I'm an instructor and department chair of anthropology and sociology, just that's down the road in Mount Laurel at Rowan College. And so what I'm going to do with my talk here is sort of two sections. The second half of the talk going to focus on recent trends in anti-Semitism, different ways of understanding that across the United States recently, both in opinions that people hold and also actual harassment, violence, action, these sorts of things regarding putting those opinions into action. I want to couch, I think it's appropriate, however, in the first part of the talk to sort of contextualize that. And I'm going to contextualize that by looking at an area of research that I specialize in and have specialized in for some years, which is right-wing voters in the United States. Because we have seen over the past years and especially decades, a movement from anti-Semitic opinions have existed across the political spectrum for some time in the US. But especially the last few years and last few decades, it's really concentrated much more on the right, in right of center voters, people that identify explicitly with the Republican Party and tend to vote Republican versus non-Republican. So I'm going to couch this in what I'm calling, and I think is, a fairly popularly known thing, especially if you are engaged with political news in the United States, the recent realignment of the Republican Party to a more nationalist sort of mindset, compared to a pre-2015, pre-Donald Trump, if you will, sort of Republican Party. And I think those sort of trends will then help couch and explain some of the things we're seeing with anti-Semitism and some of the trends we see with that, if that makes sense. So that's what I'm going to try to do, to try to frame our talk and have it in sort of two sections like that. And the evidence that I'm going to use here this evening is going to be focused on sort of two avenues. I'm going to be bringing in and showing you some data from some larger surveys that have been done about anti-Semitism and what I'm calling nationalist voters, or what are, I would say, Republican Party voters, and their opinions. And these are surveys that ask very short questions about political opinions, about ethnic groups, these sorts of things, to a large sample of people across the United States, thousands of people, to try to get a big picture of what people in the United States are thinking about politics, about ethnicity, these sorts of issues, these sorts of topics. I'm also then going to take some data, some evidence from my own research What I do in my research that I do personally is I do what is called ethnographic research. Now, what that means is I don't do large surveys with short questions. I do much smaller samples. I'll ask about people's political opinions and about their, their opinions and beliefs on these sorts of topics, but do it with much more in-depth questions and do it with a smaller sample, maybe like 50 or 60 people. That provides depth of understanding of how people think about these things. And it's sort of a supplement, it sort of complements what the larger surveys do. So that's what I'm going to try to do. Hopefully that makes sense so far. And so I think personally that good social science, understanding society scientifically, the best social science tries to mix those two things. And so that's what I'm going to try to do here this evening with you all as well. And hopefully we'll make sense out of it. So the title of my talk here, From Hatred to Conspiracy, Political Opinions and Belief Among U.S. Nationalist Voters. Now, I deploy a few terms here, just to start with. Nationalist. This is, again, sort of describe what I think is an accurate description when you look at the policy preferences and the political beliefs of most Republican Party identified voters today, what they actually believe. It is a form of nationalism. This is not your father's Republican Party, is what I would say. Again, for those of you that do follow the news fairly closely, especially political news, especially within the past 5 or 6 years, that's not necessarily new news. There has been, here's a way to think about it. Political parties, sometimes people, especially Americans, often think of political parties as maybe these sort of stable things that are very ideologically driven and have these very set ideologies. And if you look at the way people vote and the way people believe and think about politics, that's really not the best way to look at it. Political parties are ever-changing things. I think the more accurate way to look at political parties is that they are basically representations of different constituencies at any given moment. And if you look at who votes Republican and who votes Democrat, that changes over time. And so what we've seen is, especially since 2015, and what I think most political scientists and social scientists would identify as the realignment of the Republican Party, that has also taken some of it in a more anti-Semitic direction in some quarters of it. The people that vote Republican have changed. Let me give you a small data point on this. It's not small, but it is just one data point. If you were to rewind 20 years ago, 63% of non-college educated people voted Democrat. Today, that is 28%. There has been a huge shift of non-college educated, especially non-college educated whites, towards the Republican Party. This one data point represents some of these constituency shifts that I'm talking about, okay? And so if we understand politics as more of a bottom-up thing, meaning that what political leaders say and what they represent as driven by the constituencies they represent and who vote for them, then I think some of the stuff we're going to talk about later in this discussion will make more sense, okay? So that's at least the way I sort of look at these things. And so you see here on the screen here what was unfortunately sort of typical at the arena-style rallies that the former President Donald Trump would hold occasionally during his various campaigns and also during his presidency. You would see occasionally, especially in the later years of his presidency, these conspiracy theory signs, Q signs, QAnon. Perhaps, again, those of you that are news savvy and follow the news, you've almost certainly heard of this if you do follow political news of the past few years, and especially the past year since the pandemic started. QAnon is a rapidly growing set of sort of media, online media sites that represent a set of conspiracy theories that many Republican voters now believe in. I don't have time during this talk. It's not the primary portion of the talk, but I could show you a ton of data that shows anywhere from 20 to 30+% of self-identified Republican voters believing in most or all of QAnon related conspiracy theories. This is a rapid increase in a belief in a large set of conspiracies. And I put this as the sort of beginning image here because this set of conspiracies, which again, a quarter to a third of Republican voters self-identify and say they believe in, and some fervently believe in it, that there is a lot of anti-Jewish and anti-Semitic tropes and beliefs couched within it. Okay, and so we're going to explore part of that too as we go along. Okay, so just a little bit about, again, sort of the context here of right-wing voters, some of the things I study, and then again, we'll talk about the anti-Semitism more specifically and in detail, um, uh, again, sort of in the second half of the talk. The realignment of the Republican Party to what I would refer to, and I think political scientists refer to as nationalism, versus what was sort of the classic Republican Party, which is more of a what would be called the traditional American type of conservatism. I want to define what nationalism is. Any academic here, my job as a social scientist is to parse out terms and then define them and then measure them systematically. Okay, so let's make sure we understand our terms. And this again will relate to our other topics like the anti-Semitic portion of this. Nationalism is the idea that a nation should be governed by a demographic group that represents what is thought to be as the one historic culture of that nation by socially and economically promoting that group above others. A key goal then of nationalism is to establish and maintain a single national identity based on ethnicity, culture, language. Think of having one official and only one language in a nation, and a unified sort of political thought as well. This is then thought to promote then through these avenues a national unity and solidarity. And if you look at the Republican Party since 2015, there have been major shifts towards this type of ideology. Now, you look at that definition, this is a pretty pretty broad-based accepted definition of what nationalism is, I would certainly say. You can probably see how it's not far away from the extreme end of the right end of the spectrum, which is fascism. Nationalism says, a nation should have sovereignty over its borders, that there is essentially one ethnic group that represents that nation. This is why, by the way, nationalism historically has been very prominent on the right in Europe. Think of all of the different cultures of Europe, all of the small geographic nations. And if you look at right of center politics in Europe, historically it's been very nationalist. Now that hasn't been very big historically in the United States. There have been pockets of it before, but it hasn't represented a large portion of the right for basically the entire history of the United States. It has now become very prominent. And what kind of the irony of this is that for many years, the right oftentimes lamented how much of the United States was becoming Europeanized. Whether that is true or not is another debate. But it's kind of an irony that the current Republican Party has essentially imported what is a European style of nationalist type of political philosophy and political thinking and sort of policy positions. And so nationalism is basically one or a few steps away from fascism, which is, taking this sort of ideology to the extreme. Well, there's one group that represents the nation. Well, then we should eliminate other groups. And that is when you get fascism. Okay, so nationalism is sort of the mild version of fascism when we look at that side of the political spectrum. Okay, some examples. We'll talk about some of the examples of how the Republican Party is realigned to nationalism. Nationalism is also oftentimes associated and linked with what is called populism. Now, this is probably one of the most, I would say, misunderstood or just not really clearly defined political concepts that maybe exists. What is populism, after all? Again, if you follow the news, you've probably heard this term bantered around, endlessly, populism, this, populism, that. What does that actually mean? Well, if you look at nationalism, nationalism oftentimes grows out of what is thought of as populism. Populism is the idea that there is a will of the people, quote unquote, that sort of represents somehow a majority of the population in a society, and that there can exist a leader that can exhibit and embody the will of the people, okay? And that really is a kind of a nonsense concept. This is what Donald Trump was thought of as, like a populist leader, that he embodied, the will of his constituencies, right? Well, in a big, large, multi-million continental nation like the United States, there really is no such thing as the will of the people. Even in a small homogeneous nation like Sweden or Norway or the Netherlands or whatever, even in those places, any democracy, any democratic republic, you're going to have differences of opinion at a decent scale on policy issues and the way politics should run based on different demographic groups. And politics inherently is about, in a democracy, the negotiation of those differences. And so the idea of a leader, one person, representing the will of the people, quote unquote, really is undemocratic when you think about it. And so populism in that way is inherently undemocratic. It says that, there is a leader that can embody these things. Okay. The other thing that nationalism tends to do is that it tends to promote sort of group security interests over the rights of individuals and businesses and these sorts of things. And if you look at Republican opinion and Republican voters over the past few years, you see major shifts in their opinions about the amount of freedom that businesses should have over choosing what they should do with their own property. Take, for example, some of the recent controversies over Coca-Cola and all of that, as far as their own internal processes and how all those sorts of things, and how that's and how many Republicans now are choosing to boycott them and all those sorts of things. Again, these sorts of things show sort of a realignment here of not only the constituencies that would vote for the party, but just the overall opinions of what the party represents. Okay, so some differences here over time. To give you some examples of this, we see this, by the way, in the polling data when you look at, again, opinions of self-identified Republican voters, and this really starts ramping up, not surprisingly, in 2015, and that's when, again, most social scientists, most political scientists would identify this realignment really started. Okay, so we've been in this realignment now basically 6 years or so. Just some examples of this. Some of these things you may be familiar with, again, if you follow the news. A lot more explicit rhetoric to categorize non-whites as not citizens or residents of the country, right? To the point of actually trying to implement travel bans on certain countries that are, that have prominent representations of certain religions, like Muslims, or the consistent talk of deportation. Of course, that was actually a policy plank of the former president during his initial campaign back in 2015, 2016. And again, if you look at historically the Republican Party before that, there were debates about immigration, certainly within the party and across the country as well. Certainly not to the explicitness of anti-immigrant that the party has become in the past 6 years. There have been also large decreases in support for free trade, with moderate increases in support for tariffs. Again, if you rewind to the 1980s, 1990s, if you were to look at Republican voters, very high support for free trade, very low support for tariffs. You think about, the former figurehead, the person that was always referred to by Republicans as sort of the ideal Republican to aspire to, that was Ronald Reagan. This is no longer Ronald Reagan's party, certainly. This is Donald Trump's party, and he's the new figurehead after, basically, 35 years of Ronald Reagan being sort of the figurehead, the ideal sort of Republican that Republican politicians, tried to aspire to, and Republican voters kind of idealized as that ideal. Again, Donald Trump sort of represented these different trends that we're going through here. To give you an idea, free trade, support for that, for Republican voters, generally, if you look pre-2015, hovered anywhere for about 5 to 10 years, around 65% support or so. That support is now down to about 25%. That's what we call a sea change, especially in less than 10 years. To go from a large set of constituencies saying they support a policy position generally at a rate of 65% versus 25%. That's a gigantic change. So, so again, just another sort of data point here showing some of the realignment. Increases in agreement that government has the right to determine what private businesses can do with their property. Again, these are obviously debatable issues. I'm not presenting these as right or wrong issues, but I am saying this obviously contrasts with what the Republican Party was pre-2015, which is much more generally a pro-business in most sense of the word party, versus a much more skeptical look at many businesses, especially depending on some of what is perceived as those businesses, maybe specific political leanings, those sorts of things. And so the idea that government has the right to manage and determine those things is also a sort of new in mass sort of thing we see in support on the right side of the spectrum. And just one other point, if we look at pre-2015 Republicans, generally a little more interventionist internationally. We remember the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, and we look at there was not necessarily a supermajority support among Republican voters for those things. There was a decent amount of support, but now that those numbers have changed as well. And so an increase in support of removing troops from numerous regions of the world, and even just completely cutting off what is called foreign aid to basically any parts of the world. This is a very nationalist way of looking at things, that all money should be spent internally, that there should not even be such a thing as foreign aid. And that is certainly a sort of extreme and new version of what is now republicanism versus prior years. Okay, some other things here. Long-term trends about, I'm just sort of going to finish up here talking about the realignment of right-wing voters, and then sort of get into some of my data, and then we'll get into the how this relates to anti-Semitism and the conspiracy theories of this. So there have been long-term factors that have sort of contributed to this realignment. A lot of work has been done on this. This is still, given some of the really extreme conspiratorial and in many ways dangerous beliefs that we're going to look at that exist on the right in the present day. This is something that has been, talked about a lot, especially in the news, and is honestly being studied a lot now too. How this realignment has occurred and how this has happened to the right side of the political spectrum. A lot of things contribute to this. A lot of big long-term trends. We've had demographic shifts and geographic isolation across the country based on urban and rural community. Here's what I mean by that. Basically, if you look at a political map of the United States and how people vote in federal elections, presidential election, Congress, congressional elections, these sorts of things, we basically have almost pure red and pure blue counties in many parts of the country. Take a look at your 2020 presidential election night map by voting district across the country, and you'll see what I mean. You look at almost any state in the country, you look at all of the rural areas, they are bright red, and you look at almost, certainly urban core areas, bright blue, and then your suburban areas have turned basically very blue as well. We have an intense and growing isolation geographically between people that vote Republican and people that vote Democrat. That is not politically healthy. That is the type of political condition that leads to bad things. This is not intentional on anyone's part, of course. This is just, this is where people have decided to live with better living conditions, more resources, the ability to move where people can move to and want to move to. We have chosen, intentionally or unintentionally, to live in neighborhoods and live among people that are politically like us. Again, whether intentional or unintentional. But that has created a huge urban and rural divide politically in the country. So, and again, you can look at any federal election map and see that vividly. The big data point takeaway from the 2020 presidential election, in my opinion, was that the red counties got more red and the blue counties got more blue. these trends are not only stark, they're continuing to increase. So this is not unfortunately going away anytime soon, and it does then lead to these sort of culture sort of differences that we see too, where we've got people living in different parts of the country and living in some ways fundamentally different lives and having fundamentally different political opinions and not intermixing and not interacting very much. We have continued gerrymandering then of these districts. So that makes the problem even worse. You've already got people, basically Republicans living among Republicans, Democrats living among Democrats. Then on top of that, you have politicians at the state level, the different parties basically gerrymandering those districts to make them even more red or more blue, depending on the prerogative of the party in power. So that makes an extreme situation even more extreme. I can give you a data point on this too. There are various think tanks, especially organizations out of Washington, D.C. that rank, different entities in the world on democracy scores, how democratic is a country, or how democratic or how fair are elections, or how fair are the districts, proportion for voters to have their voice heard, all this sort of stuff. I can give you one example. North Carolina as a state is actually ranked as low as some lesser developed countries in the world now on their democracy score based on how their districts line up. Meaning that the districts are so gerrymandered that they're basically drawn to a point where the districts are, you are almost guaranteed an outcome, either Democrat or Republican, based on the district you live in, okay? So again, this sort of exacerbates the problem. We also have, the constituencies then also changed for both parties, right? We sort of talked about this. We have now, if you look at, people in rural areas, especially the rural Midwest and the rural South, and those that are non-college educated, many now vote Republican. This was not the case 20 plus years ago. Again, I sort of gave you that data point earlier about, a majority voting Democrat a few decades ago, now a majority voting Republican. This has been one of the big slippages on the left side of the spectrum as far as getting votes. There have been other changes where they've gained votes in other areas to counterbalance that. Again, this is the way political parties work over time, things change, but the constituencies have sort of lined up in this realignment along that urban-rural divide as well. Other things here, there's been a lot of issues, sort of social issues, especially for those considered sort of in the lower 30% income spectrum, lower and lower middle classes in the United States, breakdown of marriage, high rates of divorce, low rates of religious congregation attendance, which is sometimes a proxy measure for social scientists about community engagement. Certainly your organization, like Temple Sinai, is a synagogue. You have very good community engagement, and we, as a social scientist, one of the things we would maybe say is, well, because you're involved with a synagogue, that's not a coincidence. There's a lot of community engagement that goes along with being part of a religious organization. It's not about promoting religion or anything else, but it is a reality that people that are religiously involved tend to be more community engaged and community connected with others in their community, including strangers, than do people that are not attending any sort of religious service. So there are a lot of different works done on this recently, a lot of social science on it, but that's also sort of contributed to this realignment, and a continued increase in distrust in major media outlets. And this is sort of the final point I want to bring up, and this gets into our conspiracy theory part of this and the anti-Semitism, is one of the big overarching drivers of our politics too, and what's going on the right, is a collapse in the trust in media. We have in the United States one of the lowest public trusts in major media of any country in the world. We are generally across the US population at 10% or less as far as people saying they have high trust in what we deem as what is defined as major media outlets. We look at the right side of the spectrum, self-identified Republican voters, that number gets down to like 7.65%, depending on the survey you're looking at. That's abysmally low. And so there is basically almost no trust left on the right of center spectrum side for major media. And what's happened then is, guess what? You have this perfect storm. Online, the 2010s, social media comes in. And so now what you have on the right is you have a large set of sort of splintered media outlets on YouTube, all these different sort of social media channels where people are consuming what they call news. And unfortunately, there are a lot of bad actors and a lot of people, these are not always, this is not like turning on NBC News or CBS News back in, even 40, 50, 60 years ago, where these things were, managed by editors and, proofread and everything else. Most anybody can put anything on the internet and claim it as news. And so what we are seeing, unfortunately, in some of the media consumption studies of what people on the right are consuming, it ends up being a lot of conspiracy theories, because what we're seeing is people will latch on to anything that they want to believe from any source that will produce it, regardless of what it is. And so that's what we're seeing, unfortunately, on the right these days with media consumption. And this is where the conspiracies and other things, again, sort of enter the picture, which we'll talk about next. And then finally, a potential leader appeared and ran for high office who embodied and played to all of these different trends that we've been talking about here, and that, of course, is Donald Trump. So, some people, talk about him as some sort of genius with this. I wouldn't say that. I think he just kind of fell into something that he was acting as. He acted like a radio talk show host, right-wing talk show host, and the time was right for him, and people supported that. So that's what happened. Some things here. I think I'm maybe getting a little bit low on time. I don't want to get into the trends in anti-Semitism here, so I'm not going to spend too much time necessarily talking about my study. But here, actually, let me skip ahead here on my slides a little bit, because I want to make sure we have time for things here. I did a set of online questionnaires with self-identified nationalist voters, Republican Party voters, back in November of 2020, just a few months ago. I'm still parsing through that data. So these are some of the questions that I asked the self-identified Republican voters. Things specifically about QAnon and associated sources of QAnon. This set of conspiracy theories about, which I'll explain here in a little bit if you're not familiar. This is a big part of, again, sort of Republican mindset and Republican belief these days, unfortunately, for a good portion of Republican voters. And so, so these are some of the questions I asked about. I also asked specific questions about opinions about different ethnic groups, including Jewish people. And because, again, unfortunately, anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic sort of ideas play pretty fervently into this set of QAnon beliefs. And so, again, these are sort of the questions I asked. And I'll show you some quotes from the research I did, and we'll sort of talk about the implications of this. There's a large and growing, unfortunately, set of what I would call conspiratorial thinking on the right these days. Again, you look at the surveys, you look at my own research, this is sort of what it's showing. Now, understand that when we look at politics and how people think about politics, unfortunately, there's always been conspiracy theories, essentially. Now, if we go back again, say like, maybe 10, 15, 20 years, something like that, we would find some people believing, both on the Democratic side, Independent and Republican side, believing in some isolated conspiracy theories. Think of, for example, like, 9/11 truthers, that think, their president knew about 9/11 or these sorts of things, or the fake moon landing, those sorts of things. What is different about the conspiratorial thinking on the right these days and currently is that it's and this is my own concept that I sort of come up with in my own research. It's what I would call a complete conspiracy. What a complete conspiracy is that it's a belief that people hold that there exists a group of people, in this case for QAnon believing Republicans, that there exists a group of elites that are interlinked as family and or friends through human history. Now, understand, that sounds like a huge statement. Understand that for Republican voters, this would be conceptualized as sort of the Christian version of history, which would be a few thousand years, okay? That control nearly all of the world's major elites. Now, this is different than believing in, say, one or a few isolated events as conspiracies, meaning that there was a group of people that knew about an event and somehow controlled it. What we've seen historically is that there are some Americans that have believed isolated conspiracies, but we've never really seen a multi-digit percentage group of the electorate, which we now see on the right, believing such a large encompassing conspiracy. And what we see too, unfortunately, and this is where the anti-Semitism part comes into this, unfortunately too, is that Jewish do display prominently in this QAnon conspiracy as sort of leaders of it. Now, let me back up a little bit. I keep referring to the QAnon sort of thing. QAnon goes back to, it actually goes back to about early 2010s. It's been around for a long time. It is this, again, I'll put up the whole thing. Oh, sorry there. It's this idea that there is a group, I know this sounds pretty wild, but hang with me. There's a group of essentially child molesting, child abducting, cabal group of elites, wealthy celebrities, a lot of Democratic politicians apparently involved in this too, at least in this belief system, that essentially control most of the world's events. Now, that sounds incredibly wild, of course. I mean, just way out there sort of stuff. Yet, we legitimately see, people carrying around signs about this at political rallies. Again, the most recent surveys we have on this, we look at Republican self-identified voters. We can find anywhere from, again, 20 to 30% saying they believe in most or all of this, or are at least open to the idea that it's true. By the way, this is not isolated completely to Republicans. If you look at independents, meaning non-registered voters, non-Democrat or non-Republican registered voters, we actually see upwards of double-digit percentages of independents saying they're open to believing this too. So this is obviously a very dangerous thing when you look at the nature of these beliefs. The Rothschild family is a very prominent player in this conspiracy. The Rothschild family is the large, very wealthy family. It actually has its origins back in the mid-1700s in Frankfurt, Germany, Jewish family. It's a very, very, it's a long-time wealthy banking family. Now, it's has many members even in the present day. It's has many different relatives all over the world these days. It's a large lineage. It's because of its historical prominence, and because of the tendency of people who delve into conspiracy theories to be also partially anti-Semitic. They've tended to be a very prominent sort of trope in this set of conspiracies, that the Rothschild family is essentially behind a lot of this control of major world events. George Soros is also a major player here in this conspiracy, according to this belief system. Obviously, a Hungarian Jew and longtime social activist, and because of his historical support of many what have been seen as politically leftist causes, it seems that he's been very ripe to be put into this conspiracy by the people that propagate it and believe it as well. Okay, so some other things about this. The sort of basic belief here, which is getting very wild and somewhat disturbing to talk about, but this is what the belief is. And from what I can gather and what I think other researchers have been able to gather, it's kind of hard to determine who they think is this cabal, but it seems to include nearly all, because it's not really clearly defined by the literature, and I use the term literature loosely, that promotes these sorts of conspiracies. It's just people basically making stuff up. But it seems to include nearly all of the world's wealthy, most of the world's major celebrities, what are defined as Democratic politicians at the federal level, and Democrat voting federal bureaucrats, and those sorts of things. Meaning that this constitutes, in the belief system, thousands, if not tens of thousands of people. So this is a very serious thing. When you talk about, again, a large portion of the electorate thinking that this is actually maybe somehow the way the world works, and how and that there are literally, you know, thousands of people that are involved in this. Okay, so, and again, unfortunately, the anti-Semitic tropes are a part of this. Now, let me see here. I'm doing on time. Okay, I don't want to take up too much more time. So let's talk about some of the things, um, some of the anti-Semitic portions here. Let's see. Some quotes from some of the studies I've looked at here is so from my study as far as some responses I picked out as far that sort of represent the conspiratorial thinking of Republican voters. I'll just read some of these. Okay. Well, the world is run by these people. They run everything, you know. They constantly steal from us, take our tax money, and give us nothing in return. This is sort of a big theme. The idea that the cabal, in some ways led, unfortunately, on their mindset by Jews, is stealing from us, is somehow cheating us. And now, again, I use these are obviously disturbing quotes, but they are, you know, quotes. And I take them out as sort of representing sort of multiple responses that I saw in my own research and my own fieldwork. The cabal has records on everybody in the world, what everyone is worth and what everyone owes. All of this will be set back to normal soon. There is an idea in this belief system that somehow the money that they paid to government is somehow going to be returned to them, that they've been stolen from for many years. That's going to be returned to them. This sort of plays into, unfortunately, to a lot of the sort of financial tropes that have been very stereotypical, you know, anti-Semitic tropes for years, for as long as there have been anti-Semitic tropes. And so, you know, you can sort of see some of the themes here that relate to anti-Semitism as well. These people have been, this is another quote. I usually try, I put the worst quotes last, I guess. These people have been abducting our children for years and teaching our children how to hate America. We have whole generations that are brainwashed and follow this crap. Okay. So again, you know, a belief system that there is this group controlling everything, that are, you know, immoral, criminal, brainwashing our kids, stealing from us, all this criminal activity, all these horrible, immoral things. Okay. And so, so we see that, you know, and I've seen that, unfortunately, in my own fieldwork too, in some of the responses. Another thing here, this responding specifically references Q, of QAnon. Okay. Q is showing everyone what the truth really is. I completely agree with everything Q is exposing. Q, by the way, if I can interrupt my reading of the quote here, it's the term QAnon comes from this what was an anonymous social media poster for some years who called himself Q. He posted on various social media sites that were right-wing sort of sites, and basically claimed to be an insider of the government. And that's kind of how this whole idea of a elite cabal in this modern version of this conspiracy sort of started. And so that's what the person is referring to here as Q of QAnon. The president, referring to Donald Trump, the president will expose all of them for who they are so we can be a country again. Okay. Then one other thing here, the military and President Trump will take back the country and get rid of these people. There are a lot of arrests planned, and I have a deep sense of justice. People will be brought to justice. We see here, I saved this quote for later too, the level of belief in this. You know, this person referencing their own sense of justice, and that, you know, this cabal will be brought to justice. Okay, it sort of shows the deepness and the ingrainedness that the belief, you know, as far away from reality as the beliefs are, how deeply ingrained, despite how far it is from reality, it can be. Okay, so we see that, and I see that in my research too, unfortunately. Okay. Again, I don't want to take too much. We're at 7:20, 8:20, excuse me. Maybe I should. I don't know if it's a good place, maybe here, for me to stop a little bit, or I want to give time for discussion and questions. I'm sorry, I went a little slower than I initially thought. I didn't end up getting into some of the more some of the data more specifically on anti-Semitism, which I had, but I hope what I've gone through so far is sort of giving you an idea of sort of how this, how thinking has evolved on the right.
Can you give us some of the data
Sorry,
points?
Ellen, go ahead.
Yeah,
Yes.
go ahead. Give us a few of the data points on anti-Semitism.
Yeah, sure. And then I can sort of
Jump ahead to
summarize
that.
and link it directly to what we just talked about here the last few minutes. How about that? And I'll sort of end that way. Let me sort of bring up I'm going to bring up my whole slides here and then just get down to some of the things here. Why don't I do this? Because I had a lot of stuff and not going to have time to get through it all. Why don't I just sort of hit my last few summary slides, then we'll have a discussion. Okay, I think that'll be most appropriate here. So here's sort of the deal. If we sort of put together all of the recent things on both opinion about measuring anti-Semitic opinion in the United States, and also looking at anti-Semitic incidents, here's, I think, what we can sort of say. First of all, and again, I'm sorry I don't have the time to sort of show you all of this data, but I can at some point if you ever want me to. First of all, we have to understand that, and it's one of the things I also like to say when I talk about how Americans and how people think about politics, we have to also understand that when we talk about politics and society and how people think about it, a lot of times people don't necessarily have a lot of knowledge about it. The first thing I would sort of say in summary is that if you actually look at people's knowledge of anti-Semitism, quote unquote, in general, over 50% of the American public doesn't even actually know what the term anti-Semitism means. Now, of course, I say that for a few reasons. A person doesn't have to know what anti-Semitism means or what constitutes anti-Jewish thought. They can still be anti-Jewish but not know what the term means, right? So I sort of want to say that first. If you actually look at just people being able to define what it is, there are many Americans that can't define what it is. That doesn't mean that they are not capable of holding those opinions, but we just should sort of start that as sort of a starting point of maybe sort of summary about this. Knowledge of anti-Semitism and being able to define what it is more specifically tends to be concentrated among the highly educated in the United States. And by the way, that's not just in the United States. We also see that in Europe and other places. So it's not just an American thing. There are many people across the world that don't know about politics or ethnicity or other things in much of the world. It's not just an American thing. If you look at actual measurements of opinion, meaning, statements that are considered anti-Semitic. The Anti-Defamation League has big surveys they do that sort of have these standard questions of that sort of measure anti-Semitism. Generally, if you look across the entire U.S. population, over the past 10 or so years, it looks like that number is actually pretty stable, maybe decreasing. Now, understand that's across the entire U.S. population. U.S. population is a huge thing, 330, 340 million people. But we need to specify this because there has been, if you follow the news, you've seen this, there has been an increase in anti-Semitic incidents, especially recently. There has been an increase in anti-Semitic, mass shootings, targeted at Jewish, unfortunately, these sorts of things. And so basically what I'm saying is that although there's good news here, if you look at the entire US population, anti-Semitic opinions are generally low and getting lower, but there is a radicalized element specifically on the right that is perpetrating violence and more prone to perpetrate violence. And so it's basically it's becoming an isolated set of opinions on the far right that is then also unfortunately prone to actually acting it out. Okay, so that's kind of, I think, the situation we're in. The perception of anti-Semitism is rapidly increasing among the US population. If you look at surveys, they will show you that of the entire US population, they will show you that if people, do you think that there's more discrimination, this year compared to last year? against blacks, against Hispanics, against Jewish, against, take any ethnic group. The perception that there's discrimination and prejudice against Jewish has a huge increase compared to other groups. That's gone up 20+ percentage points across the ideological spectrum in the U.S. population, meaning that there's a perception, a big perception, that there is more anti-Semitism. By the way, there's even more perception of anti-Semitism on the right, which is kind of ironic. I mean, if you look at Republican voters, they also show a large increase in the perception that there is more anti-Semitism, even though that now tends to be the side that is perpetrating most of this, at least that that side. There has been, unfortunately, an increase in mass shootings, harassment, and online intimidation of Jewish people. Again, we see this basically concentrated now of people of right-leaning, especially extreme right-leaning persuasion. And the online intimidation has especially increased too. Obviously the online environment, especially since the pandemic. There have been multiple, many different incidences of what is actually called Zoom bombing, which is where people intentionally go into live Zoom conferences such as this, and then put up hate symbols or do some sort of online intimidation, that sort of thing. I believe there have been over 140 different Jewish schools or synagogues over the past year that have been subject to that, sometimes multiple times. And so again, what you're seeing is because of this conspiratorial thinking. This is sort of my argument. This rise in conspiratorial thinking, this rise in that sort of political mindset, nationalist mindset on the right, you're getting this concentration of anti-Semitism on the right as well. And finally, one other point here, I didn't have time to cover this in detail, but we do see, unfortunately, on the right too, there's actually a fair amount of anti-Semitism where it's concentrated among the young too, among those below 30 years of age. And that is not isolated to European descent whites. We also see it among African American and Hispanic portions of the right-wing population. There are Hispanic and African American right-wing voters. There are not necessarily many of them, but they do exist. And when they do when they do exist, they can hold sometimes fervently anti-Semitic beliefs. And so that's maybe a counterintuitive point. It's not something we necessarily think about a lot. But it does exist, and so we see that in a lot of the survey data too. And finally, I'll put this as my last point here. I do want to, I do want to sort of end this with a word of caution, because we have this rapid increase of, again, this very, honestly, quite weird, quite dangerous, quite extreme, quite incredibly far from reality set of beliefs and conspiracies on a good portion and growing on the right. I would say that there is, unfortunately, a long-term concern that there could be an increase in anti-Semitism among those groups because of the couched Jewish elements in those conspiracies that are part of those conspiracies. Okay. You look at a lot, and again, I'll take this from my own field work. You look at a lot of these sort of middle-aged and older Republican voters that have gone the conspiratorial thinking sort of way. The Jewish issues are some of those things that cross-cut left and right really in a weird kind of way. I mean, you have the Republican Party that tends to be, supportive of obviously Israel and all of these sorts of things, and then you have, a fair amount of Republican voters also, self-identifying saying they support Israel. But then you also have these conspiratorial ideas that tend to be anti-Semitic, and so it's a very weird kind of juxtaposition. So what I'm saying is that there is the potential for, and I'm not predicting that it will happen. But I'm saying there's the potential, because of those conspiracy theories and their anti-Jewish nature, for what could be an increase in anti-Semitic thought, especially among middle-aged and older Republican voters in the future. And that's really going to depend, and I say this in the last line here, That's really going to depend on the political rhetoric from the leaders of the Republican Party. And it's also going to depend a lot on the online misinformation that those Republican voters consume, whether it is how explicitly anti-Semitic it gets or how explicitly non-anti-Semitic it is. Okay. So, as I say, a social scientist, not always the prettiest things to talk about, sometimes a little bit weird too when we talk about political beliefs of Americans and humans, but hopefully you found it interesting. I'm sorry I didn't get to cover everything, and hopefully I didn't bore you too much, and hopefully we have some interesting things that we can talk about. If we have some questions, we can certainly take those. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chapman. If anyone wants me to call on them, please put your name in the chat. I have the question of why does QAnon, why is the right so focused on Jews as being the cabal? Is it just following the historical Jews run everything, or are there new reasons?
If you look at, first of all, the beliefs that constitute QAnon, you know, if you saw quickly on the slide, when I did my fieldwork, I said QAnon and associated sources. The literature on QAnon is vast, unfortunately. There are literally tens of thousands, if not more, entities on YouTube, on all these different social media sites that produce stuff that is basically QAnon related. It's a wide variety of stuff. But there's a sort of a common thread through a lot of it. And what it is it tends to take a lot of the historically persistent conspiracies, if you will. And I think your questioner is sort of implying that, there are, if you unfortunately look at a lot of the history of conspiracies of world control, it involves conspiracies about Jewish. And so I think that's where a lot of this comes from, is if it's again, it being a complete conspiracy, it's almost kind of a combination of a lot of the historical conspiracies that you see. The idea that there's a Jewish family controlling the world's finances, and financing major operations or something like that in the world. That's the old sort of Rothschild and those sort of
we have a question of how can we effectively counter or combat these conspiracies with the people who believe them? In other words, how can reality burst through the bubble?
That's probably the $64,000 question, right? What's the solution to this? Believe me, I've thought about this too. This is probably the toughest thing. Let me give you some context on this. A lot of we all probably saw or and are familiar with the January 6th insurrection. A lot of those folks are QAnon believers, basically, and Republican voters, Trump voters certainly. Only 9% of those folks were affiliated with an extremist organization like the Proud Boys or something else, meaning that almost all of them, 9 out of 10 of those folks, were our friends and neighbors, business owners, doctors, lawyers. I'm not exaggerating when I say that either. This was not the lower class. It was not unemployed people sitting in their basement. Real estate agents. There was a State Department official at the insurrection participating in it. I say all of that because, and if you look at again the growing and widespread amount of people that believe in QAnon and these conspiracies, it's not. I mean, it's a lot of middle class and even some upper middle class folks. I say that because this is not, when we've dealt with political extremism historically, sometimes it's been a thing where it's been concentrated among like the youth or college students or those sorts of things. Or this is a completely different thing. We're talking about a large swath, and I think the survey data would legitimately show this, of middle class America. And so how do you combat that? I'm not trying to avoid the question. I'm saying it's a tough one. I think this is something new. I think this is something completely novel that we're dealing with in that sense.
Where,
And oh,
oh,
go ahead.
sorry.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Where do Christian evangelicals fit in with this?
Um, well, and so let me say what if I can really quickly before I answer that next question, just to finish the previous answer. Look, you know, it's the best advice I can give is we have to do the hard work, and that is you have to try to be reasonable with people, try to convince them the best you can. Look, we have social science studies on everything. We have social science studies on how to we've had for decades about how do you most effectively convince somebody of a political opinion, like how to change their opinion on a political issue or something like that, or a social issue. What we consistently find is the most effective way to do that is to try to understand the core value or value that the person is trying to communicate, and then approach the issue from the perspective that the other person is taking. Now, I admit, with a set of conspiracy theories like this, that becomes a maybe almost an impossible thing to do in this case. When we're talking normal politics and policy issues, that's probably an easier thing than dealing with QAnon. But I'm saying, you know, there can be various strategies for this. But we have to do more than just listen. I hear a lot of times, you know, obviously listening is important, but we also have to try to convince people too. We need to listen to them and convince, and try to show them, you know, reality the best we can. How do so the question was, how do Christian evangelicals fit in?
As well as the Christian apocalyptic thought.
Yes. Okay. So to take one at a time here, I'll take the last one first. The apocalyptic ideas are entrenched in QAnon belief. There is, well, if you remember the image at the start of the talk, there was that gentleman in the on the right-hand side with the black shirt. It said the Great Awakening, Q on it. The Great Awakening. This idea that people will be awoken to the scripture, if you will, of QAnon. Okay, there are a lot of there are a decent amount of religious overtones in Q literature. There is the idea that, and I think you saw this in one of the quotes from my fieldwork too. This is a very commonly held belief among QAnon believers, is that it's hard to say, you know, Donald Trump would be responsible for this, that he will bring about the arrest of the cabal and will bring about a utopia after that is done. Literally, I know this is hard to believe. There are a good amount of QAnon believers that see Donald Trump as some sort of Christian patriot, that he is going to somehow bring about a sort of rebirth of the world. Now, that's a very apocalyptic sort of, you know, view of things. And so I know we have some, you know, head shakings about that. I know this is wild stuff, but it is, you know, but that is those are the beliefs. So your questioner there is you know, very spot on here with that question. The apocalyptic thought here is really big. It's a really big part of it. Now how much does the Christian evangelical, you know, how much of this is Christian evangelicals that believe this? I hesitate to say that as a percentage. That's a little harder to parse out. And I've looked at this a lot in terms of the political ideological spectrum. I haven't looked at it necessarily in terms of, well, actually, here's what I can say. From the data I have seen on it, it's a little bit, I think it's a little bit of a stereotype to think that QAnon believers that are Republicans, that almost all of them are Christian evangelicals. Actually, there's a good amount that are not necessarily explicitly religious. What some of this, I think, is, and there have been, and I'm not the only social scientist that have started to make this argument, is that some of it is almost kind of a replacement for religion for some people. If you look at folks that vote Republican now and believe in QAnon, it is, it has become a lot more of the white working class, non-college educated white working class, again, especially in the rural Midwest and the rural South. Formal religion has, in some ways, collapsed in some of those communities. There are a lot of people not going to church anymore and all that sort of stuff. And this, in a way, has kind of replaced that religious sort of set of characteristics, something to believe in, a change in the world that's going to come, a leader, that's, not the Messiah, but some other type of leader to believe in, those sorts of things. It has the dabbling sort of characteristics of religion. There's a reason why, people have called it a cult. And so, I would caution to stereotype this as, it's not just Christian evangelicals. There are actually a fair amount of people that believe, that are QAnon believers, that are not explicitly religious. And I would say that it actually, for some of them, acts as a replacement for what otherwise maybe would have been religion in their lives. So if that makes sense.
Do you think a virtual confederacy exists? I'm not sure.
There's a virtual almost everything. Now, I'm sorry, I have to admit, I don't, with your question there, whoever asked it, I'm not necessarily familiar with a quote unquote virtual confederacy, or maybe that concept. So I'm not sure if I can directly answer that question. I can say that, again, if you look, there is an element among QAnon believers that are formally a part of very fervent right-wing organizations like the Proud Boys, that are explicitly, anti-Semitic, anti-Black, basically Confederate or fascist, or whatever you want to, whatever you want to pin them as. But again, there's a lot of people that are not explicitly that also believe in this too. So, but I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with the concept of the virtual confederacy, so I don't know if I can directly answer it.
And the last question, have things changed since Joe Biden and the left has been returning money to people? Are they feeling less like the government's taking their money and not giving it back?
That's a this is actually an interesting, this is actually maybe an ironic point to end on, perhaps. I've besides the online questionnaires that I've done with right-wing voters, I've also spent I've done previous in-person interviews among them in previous studies, and I've spent a fair amount of time in people's homes that have these beliefs, and just been around people of these beliefs. I can tell you that generally what happens is that, and I've seen this recently too, with my own eyes and my own ears multiple times, is that when the QAnon conspiracy is so malleable and so flexible that it morphs anything into pro-nationalist and pro-Republican and anti-Democrat. So generally, most people are happy with getting a stimulus check. Okay, that's not a surprise. Now, when it was the Donald Trump, it was the Trump administration that did that, of course, QAnon believers and Republicans, okay, yay, okay, very happy. But then when, a Biden administration does it, first of all, you have to understand that QAnon believers, many of them still believe that Donald Trump is actually acting somehow as president. And so they somehow, anything that they like, they attribute it to Donald Trump. So if you look at the QAnon literature, the QAnon associated blogs, all these sorts of things that constitute this, they will just say that, well, somehow he is secretly controlling this, and that's the reason you're getting the stimulus check, and they will believe it. Now, and that's also why I give a word of caution about this. Again, we didn't have time to go into how malleable and how flexible these conspiracy theories are, but that is a nature of it too. Because people are consuming things from sources that will basically write whatever suits their interests and whatever they think people want to hear. This is a set of conspiracies that morph all the time. And so that's also why I sort of gave my warning at the end of my talk about the potential for a rise in anti-Semitism. It's obviously not news I want to, give, and especially not to this audience. But this is a set of beliefs that can really morph quite quickly. And it's something that can be so far from reality. Um, the point is it can morph in almost any direction. And so, we see that with this, addressing this question here with the Biden, stimulus checks. If you were to ask my study participants and QAnon believers, what's going on with that, they would say, well, Donald Trump was somehow responsible for that. And so it's a belief system that it's like the internet. It's like whatever trends and whatever it morphs into, and that's a dangerous thing. So it's a very interesting and difficult thing sometimes, especially for social scientists like me to try to understand too, because of that constant morphing.
Thank you. I appreciate your coming out tonight and speaking with us. I have all of your slides. Can I make them available to anyone if they want to go through it in depth?
Yes, of course. You can make anything. I sent you my slides, Ellen, and yes, if anybody wants access to anything I presented or anything at all, or ask further questions, I'm available. You can send anything to anybody. It's all open. So go ahead.
Thank you very much, and good night, everyone, and happy Memorial Day.
Thank you, everybody.